what are the pathways, what are the causal factors in these outcomes that you're finding? And I was completely struck dumb. I couldn't say anything, I went bright red, I mumbled something incomprehensible. And then I went away and spent the next 6 months trying to work out, really, with my team, what is going on here. And these pathways of risk really tell us what we might be able to do. This is a statistical program called structural equation modeling. It's essentially a way of holding all of these factors in these kids' lives statistically up in the air at the same time and seeing how they link in with each other. And what we can see here is that things that we can't change can be mitigated by things that we can change. And I'm just going to talk you through it. So if you look on the left here, if a child is orphaned by AIDS or has an AIDS-sick caregiver, there's not actually much we can do about that. This is the situation and the life context that they're in. But we see that AIDS orphanhood and having an AIDS-sick parent lead directly into increased poverty. We also see that having an AIDS-sick parent leads directly into abuse, and being AIDS orphan leads to abuse via poverty. They're more stressed, they're poorer, it's harder to parent. We again see direct links from AIDS-sick parent and AIDS orphanhood into stigma. And this combination of poverty, stigma, and abuse is leading to increased psychological distress in the kids. And it's that psychological distress that's leading to the sexual health risks. Now, even if we can't change these, we might be able to change these ones in the middle if we're going to impact on the risk of that child becoming HIV positive. So this leads us to think, what can we do? And this, what I'm showing you today, you're the first people to see these analyses. They're in preparation for UNICEF and USAID meetings next week. So if you spot anything wrong, please tell me. But I thought I'd try and get them to you first. So first of all, we try and use these risk pathways to identify where we might be able to intervene. And you can see many of these things map on directly to the kind of work that Africa Tikkun, that Starfish, and that Food Bank South Africa are doing. We can see that they're trying to impact these particular pathways on the road to risk. But we also need to think about what we would call in science the theory of change. Why do we think that having these interventions or these programs is going to make an impact? And here's a nice, clear theory of change. Cash transfers and school meals mean that girls are less likely to need a sugar daddy or an older boyfriend to pay for their food, and free schools mean they're less likely to need a sugar daddy to pay for their school fees. So we're hoping that these three factors might have an impact on reducing transactional sex in girls. Now, this is a theory, but we can test it using this national data set, which follows these girls and boys over a year. And what's really valuable about this is that we can look at incidence. And what incidence means is that we can say, of all the kids who've had one of these things, like a grant or a school meal or free schooling, over the 2 years, how many of them newly begin to start these negative actions or have these negative outcomes over the year? And it can really tell us about causality. And to our surprise, but also to our real relief, we're finding that there are real impacts. And this looks at child-focused grants. This is like a child support grant or a foster care grant, but it's the same for any kind of grant. Any cash transfer into the home brings the same results. You can see that girls who have a grant over 2 years are much less likely to be having transactional sex or to start having transactional sex than girls who don't. It's about 3 times less likely. When we look at free school access, we see a similar pattern. Girls who have access to a free school over a year are much less likely, it's probably about half less likely, to be having transactional sex. We also see that it doesn't just have impacts on transactional sex and other sexual outcomes. It also has impacts on school dropout. And we see that girls who have grants and girls who have access to free school meals are much less likely to drop out of school. That's quite a large, that was about 4 or 5 times less likely. And of course, when we do this, we control for all kinds of things. We control for their poverty, their age, where they live, are they urban or rural, what kind of family do they live in, how close and how good are their family. So we're pretty sure that this is what's predicting it. When we look at boys, we see some slightly different findings. we see that boys who have access to free school or to school support are much less likely to fail their grades. They're also much less likely to drop out of school. And interestingly, we found this only this morning, boys who have access to things like free school and school meals and grants are much less likely to be involved in delinquent activities or to be members of gangs or to carry guns and knives. I'm not quite sure how we're going to deal with this yet. I'll go talk to the Ministry of Justice, who may or may not like these outcomes. So what can this tell us for our programming, for our interventions, and for our decisions about what we support? It tells us that there's very clear evidence that children in AIDS-affected families are at massively higher risk. I think there's no point at which now that we can't argue that that's not happening now. It's very clear. It also tells us that reducing particularly sexual risks for AIDS-affected children needs more than just behavioural interventions. It needs social and psychological interventions. Thirdly, it tells us these interactive models tell us that there are modifiable and changeable things that we can do to turn children at a high-risk situation into children who can have positive outcomes. It tells us what some of those places we might be able to intervene in, particularly poverty, abuse, stigma, and psychological distress, but also thinking about how those outcomes interlink. By helping with education, we can also help with mental health. By helping with mental health, we can reduce sexual health risks. And finally, I think this is really good news, that social protection programs and intervention programs can reduce risks for vulnerable and AIDS-affected children in South Africa. So this is a bunch of papers, but they take rather a long time to read, and I don't necessarily suggest you do. You've probably seen it all now. A thank you to the funders of our research. And I'd like to end not with my words. I'd like to end with the words of one of our teen advisory group. This was our last teen advisory group weekend. It looks sunny, don't be fooled. It was freezing, icy cold, and we'd just been up all night huddling under blankets. But we asked our teen advisory group whether they had a message for people around the world who were working to help children like them. And this is what one of them wanted us to tell you. I think she says it much better than I do. Thank you. Very happy to take questions. You've all been very polite and not heckled.
I wanted to start off, if I may. Something that you mentioned, Julie mentioned, and we see every day in our work is the issue of stigma. And I know it's something that came up even when you were conducting your questionnaires. I just wondered if you wanted to talk to us a bit more about your findings in that area and how you feel as NGOs on the ground we can best fight against it.
Stigma's the toughest one of all, and I'm not sure we do know what to do about it. It's very clear that stigma is absolutely pervasive in South Africa. I don't know what it's like and whether it's better elsewhere. It's absolutely pervasive in the communities, and these children feel desperately set apart and stigmatized. And that stigma is very clearly affecting their lives. And we talk to government about this, and government throw their hands up in the air. They say they don't know what to do about stigma. And actually, if you look at the research evidence, there's not very much good evidence from anywhere. There's a couple of studies in the US where they give individual, intensive, one-to-one counselling for 12 weeks, and people's stigma reduces slightly. That's, of course, it's not feasible in South Africa. But what you do see, actually, is that children who are affected by HIV/AIDS gain an enormous amount of comfort from having the opportunity to be in a group with other children in the same situation. It gives them, even if we can't change the stigma outside, and I'm not sure we can as NGOs or individuals or as governments, we can create a safe space for these kids where they are able to talk about what they're going through and their experiences and their hopes and the good things in a space where they know that they can do that safely. And I think that's probably the best that we can think of to do. But it could be an enormous thing for these kids to just have that once a week.
Yes, just on this, sort of on the same subject. I don't know if it's to do with stigma, But isn't it the case that AIDS is a sexually transmitted disease and people are conceived through sex? Somehow, is there a connection that those children are those youngsters are making, whereby somehow in the making of them there was this equally dangerous thing? Is that something that's going on inside them, never mind what other people are thinking?
It's a really interesting question, and there's a wider question around that about how do children and their parents interact when there's HIV in the family. Your question I don't know the answer to, and it would take really, really trusting, good research to try and... You almost wouldn't want to ask that question, would you? But we do find very complex relationships, and we find, particularly for children who are HIV positive themselves, that often when their parents tell them that they're HIV positive, there's a huge amount of blame and anger. And I think it's a real mix for these kids, because not just are they feeling confusion and blame and anger, but they're going to school and hearing your mother's a prostitute. And they're getting these very negative stories about HIV and AIDS, which they're trying to square with their own experiences of their parents. And one of the children in our research said, it really struck me, she said, "Everyone says my mother's a whore, but she's not. She's my mother. She's a good mother." And then she said it again. And you could see that she was trying to say it to confirm it to herself. God, and I don't know how we deal with that complexity. I do know that those mothers need support as well, and the fathers need support as well, and that the more support they have, potentially the better the families can get on. It's a tough question.